In the Middle Ages, the most important worship place in the city of London was St. Paul's Cathedral, a magnificent Gothic structure whose mass dominated the skyline of the medieval city, even from the opposite side of the Thames River. St. Paul's enormous nave was longer than that of any other cathedral in Europe, and its legendary spire, taller even than the Great Pyramid of Giza, made the cathedral the second tallest structure in the world at the time. St. Paul's Cathedral rose upon Ludgate Hill, the highest point of Londinium, the old Roman city. Construction began in 1087 over the ruins of an earlier small church. St. Paul's started as a Norman Romanesque structure with rounded arches and small windows, but due to fires and problems within the kingdom, the construction was long delayed. At the time, architecture was ever on the change, and the builders didn't trouble themselves to follow the style in which a building had been begun, but went on with whatever was in use then. By the 12th century, Gothic architecture had become the standard for church building across Europe, and because churches often took centuries to complete, most cathedrals in England have some Romanesque elements, as well as some early Gothic and some late Gothic elements. Old St. Paul's Cathedral was no exception. It took so long to build that it was a very hybrid combination of Norman Romanesque and Gothic architecture. The western half was built first, so it retained its Romanesque appearance, smaller windows, round arches, and a thicker, more massive wall, with a lesser need for flying buttresses, which were evidently added later. And the eastern half was built later. Thus, you can notice it looks more Gothic in its forms, with pointed arches in the windows and vaults. Also, the cathedral was heavily repaired and modified over the centuries, so the most striking elements, such as the exquisite rose window at the east, were in the Gothic style. The spire was a structure of timber covered with lead, and it reached a height of 149 meters, making Old St. Paul's the second tallest building on Earth at the time, just behind Lincoln's Cathedral in central England, whose spire reached 160 meters. In 1561, during a severe thunderstorm, St. Paul's spire was struck by lightning and caught fire, making the entire spire collapse, and it was never rebuilt. The front facade had a distinctly Romanesque character, featuring solid masonry walls with small windows, and deep, round archivolts framing the doors. The great Cathedral of St. Paul, glorious as it was, the finest in England in its time, lasted on for nearly 6 centuries, but after the Reformation, it began to decline. The English Reformation led to the destruction of interior ornamentation such as altars, shrines, chapels, and crypts, as well as several religious buildings in the churchyard, which were seized by the crown and sold as shops to Protestant booksellers. By the end of the 16th century, the cathedral had lost its spire, its walls were falling into disrepair, and much of its heritage had been lost. The great nave, once a place of worship, became known as Paul's Walk, and had become a market and the place in London where you'd go to hear the latest news and to do business, but also a place to pick up gossip and even prostitutes, a place infested by beggars and thieves. In 1621, King James appointed Inigo Jones, the first Renaissance architect in England, to repair the structure of the cathedral and to rebuild some parts. In the 1630s, Jones added a classical porch to the front. In the early 1660s, Christopher Wren, a mathematician and astronomer with some experience as an architect, was appointed to restore the building matching the style of Inigo Jones's additions in the 1630s, and he proposed to demolish part of the central tower and replace it with a Renaissance dome. Even though his design was approved and restoration works started, St. Paul's Cathedral was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. The vaults of most Gothic cathedrals are usually made of stone, but the vaults of the old St. Paul's Cathedral were made of wood, and therefore much more vulnerable to fire. which affected the ultimate fate of the building, reducing the structure to ruins. Christopher Wren was appointed to oversee the rebuilding of London after the fire, thanks to the ingenious plan that he proposed for the reconstruction of the city. And he designed over 50 parish churches to be reconstructed, all with a unique design that explored new ideas of light, space, and order. Yet his greatest achievement, his architectural masterpiece, would be the new St. Paul's Cathedral. The destruction of the old cathedral was not total, and at first Wren began a partial rebuilding of it, but by 1668, it became clear that a complete reconstruction was necessary. So he proposed his first design for the new cathedral, a centralized plan in the shape of a Greek cross, whose arms were connected by a series of curved quadrants, instead of the traditional solution of right angles found in Bramante's or Michelangelo's original plans for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Wren incorporated a round choir on the east side and a large domed crossing similar to that of St. Peter's Basilica. When making his famous wooden model for the church, Wren added a projecting western vestibule to his design, capped by a smaller dome. As you can see from Wren's model and later drawings, this design takes much from Michelangelo's architecture: his colossal order on the exterior pilasters, his Pantheon-like portico, and the huge dome as an urban element that's meant to be seen from anywhere in the city. However, this design was ultimately dismissed by the clergy because it seemed too different from the rest of English cathedrals and too similar to the Roman Catholic churches that were being built in Rome at the time, such as St. Peter. The clergy desired a more traditional basilical plan with a long nave, transepts, and choir, more similar to the plan of the old cathedral that had burned in 1666. Although now Protestants, they were very used to the architectural program of the medieval Catholic type of plan, as they had been in use for centuries in England, and they had a certain rejection for the Baroque character that the Catholics were defining in the continent. So Christopher Wren redesigned the entire project, returning to a Latin cross plan. He added a great octagonal space in the crossing and a dome topped by a spire. It's kind of trying to hold these Italian and French Baroque impulses, expressed so strongly in his previous design, and to make something that uses a classical language with columns and round arches, but still reprises the Gothic image of Old St. Paul's Cathedral in its form. This was the design that was approved, and its construction began in 1675. However, Wren, as the architect-in-chief of the construction, was given complete liberty to make any changes and variations to his own design as he should see proper during the construction. So when we see the finished cathedral, we find a completely different building to the one that was originally approved. The final result is a refined building with perfect proportions, where you can see a clear influence of the Renaissance masters of Italy and France in every element.
Christopher Wren, the architect, was born at a time when Baroque architecture was at its highest point of development in cities like Rome and like Paris. And you can really tell that he visited those cities. He had seen the architecture of masters like Borromini, like Maderno, especially when you look at some of the elements on the facade and on the elevations of this cathedral, as well as the design of the dome and the towers.
Here are a few examples of direct influence that Wren drew from other buildings. The porticos on the north and south sides are enlarged copies of the facade of Santa Maria della Pace in Rome, made by Pietro da Cortona. The double colonnade on the front portico, as well as the double pilasters on the sides, are taken from the facade of the Louvre in Paris by Claude Perrault. Those lateral windows of the front facade recessed in a concave perspective to show the thickness of the wall for visual strength, are identical to the top windows found in the Palazzo Barberini in Rome, made by Francesco Borromini. And the towers are also reminiscent of the architecture of Borromini, when you compare them to the towers of the Church of Sant'Agnese in Piazza Navona in Rome. You can see that classic Borromini curve with the columns rotated 45 degrees. And they both have a clock and a bell shape at the top. All these elements make the new St. Paul's Cathedral look like a building from the Renaissance and Baroque period. However, if you focus more on the plan of the building, on the structure, and in its massing, you can see the clear influence from Gothic medieval cathedrals from England. St. Paul's has an extremely long nave compared to its width, something typical of the English Gothic, and the huge crossing space with a dome replaces the massive central tower in English Gothic cathedrals. Wren is trying to make a refined and academic building with a classical character that follows the principles of Renaissance architecture. But he, as a mathematician, finds many solutions that can't coexist with the rules of classical architecture, so he has to disguise some of the structural elements. You can see that above the aisle roofs, there are these flying buttresses, which are Gothic elements present in most Gothic cathedrals. So he hides these Gothic elements by raising the aisle walls, creating these screens that cover them, and thus giving the exterior a good proportional height in relation to the dome. These screen walls also act as counterweight to the flying buttresses, to redirect to the ground the thrust received by the nave vault, the same function that the pinnacles have in Gothic architecture. To support the dome, Wren combines different structural principles. Instead of just supporting a huge dome over 4 massive piers like in St. Peter's and other Italian churches, he uses a Gothic example as inspiration, Ely Cathedral. Among the medieval cathedrals in England, Ely Cathedral is very special because he has a unique octagonal crossing with a great wooden vault reaching to a central octagonal lantern, and what could look like 4 great piers in plan, such as those from St. Peter's, seems like they are dematerialized into 8 much lighter piers. So Wren takes this example and applies it to the dome of St. Paul's. You have a huge crossing space with 8 thin and delicate piers, each reaching a small triangular pendentive that holds the drum of the great dome. And because these piers are so thin, you don't read them as piers, but as columns, and the structure seems very dematerialized and delicate. You get this sense of lightness. It's like Wren is interested in the absence of material. For the actual dome, Wren followed at a certain extent the principles of Michelangelo's cupola in Rome. But he especially studied the dome of Les Invalides in Paris, which employs a triple dome system. The innermost dome, made of masonry, has a great opening at the top, through which your view vanishes to the top of the middle dome, decorated with a fresco, giving you a 3-dimensional effect. This middle dome supports the wooden structure of a 3rd outer dome. This strategy creates 2 scales, an interior scale that keeps the right human proportions inside the building, and an exterior scale that turns the massive-looking dome into an urban element visible from the distance. Since Christopher Wren needed to create a dome tall enough to dominate London's skyline, yet still maintain proper proportion within the interior of the building, he adopted the triple dome strategy of Les Invalides. The inner dome is built of masonry with a small opening at the top that allows your view to vanish right to the top of the middle dome. The middle dome is more of a brick cone that supports both the stone lantern and the wooden structure of the outer dome. If you climb up inside, you can walk through these spaces between the brick cone and the outer dome, where the timber framing and the beams that support the exterior shell rest on the brick structure, along with 32 radiating counterforts. If you look at the section of the building, you can notice that the drum of the cupola is not vertical. It tapers slightly toward the top. And the brick cone is not exactly a cone, but along with the tapering drum, forms a softly curved profile that isn't exactly spherical. The hidden flying buttresses also have this soft curve. Christopher Wren was a mathematician, and along with his colleague Robert Hooke, another illustrious mathematician of the time, developed the catenary principle. The word catenary comes from the Latin catena, which means chain, and the principle consists in the idea that the shape a chain naturally takes when hanging under its own weight, the catenary curve, is also the most stable form for an arch or dome when inverted. In other words, the curve that hangs in tension becomes the perfect curve to stand in compression. And this is a structural principle that Wren used for the middle dome and the flying buttresses. He kind of anticipated Antoni Gaudí by a couple hundred years, but Wren hid these details behind the classical language of architecture, while Gaudí created a language from these structural principles by expressing the true structure instead of concealing it behind perfect geometry. The form of the outer dome was inspired by the architecture of Donato Bramante, one of the most respected Italian architects from the High Renaissance. Wren especially took inspiration from Bramante's Tempietto, considered a perfect gem of the Renaissance because of its proportions replicating those of ancient Roman round temples. The colonnade on the drum is formed of 3/4 columns attached to radiating buttress walls, having every fourth inner columniation filled in solid, giving an appearance of strength and solidity. Behind the balustrade above the columns, there is a gallery from where the dome is resting. At the summit of the dome, there are 8 openings to light the inner domes. The total height of the dome is 365 feet, a number that was symbolic for Wren as an astronomer. At the meeting of the nave and transepts, there are projecting masses which express the support of the dome from the ground upwards. This dome is certainly one of the finest domes in Europe. To reach the top, you must first ascend the round staircase located in the south side of the nave, eventually emerging onto the gallery that encircles the base of the drum. From here, you can appreciate the spectacular expanse of the nave and crossing, and especially the geometric pattern of the pavement, revealed with a clarity that's impossible to perceive from ground level. From there, the ascent continues within the space between the brick cone and the outer dome, where the internal structure is fully exposed. The stairs grow narrower as you approach the lantern. Once you reach the lantern, there are just a few steps left to reach the summit. And there's a small window there that allows you to look straight down into the crossing. From the top of the dome, you can see the entire city of London, the Thames with its bridges, the modern skyline beyond, and in the distance, Westminster. This view must have been overwhelming at the time the cathedral was completed, thanks to the skyline filled with spires and monuments. It remained so until the late 20th century, for no building in the city rose higher than St. Paul's Cathedral. But London's harmonious skyline was eventually lost to modern skyscrapers. The interior of St. Paul's is comprised by a long nave reminiscent of medieval cathedrals in its volume, but expressed in a classical language through its decoration. The piers are ornamented with Corinthian pilasters, supporting an entablature and attic, above which are formed flat saucer domes inspired by those in the Church of Val-de-Grâce in Paris, which Wren had visited. Upon entering, you'll notice that most of the light inside the cathedral is admitted through the clerestory at the top of the nave. These clerestory windows are invisible from outside of the building because they're hidden by the screen wall. The vaults aren't particularly tall compared to other European cathedrals. Lower vaults is something inherited from English Gothic architecture. And this makes the dome appear immense, as it feels much closer to you than other great domes in Europe, such as that of St. Peter's at the Vatican. Behind the altar there is a 3-bay choir, with spectacular wood carving by the sculptor Grinling Gibbons, who was also responsible for all the stone sculpture in the cathedral. Before entering the choir, you encounter exceptional wrought iron screens crafted by the French blacksmith Jean Tijoux. And even here inside the building, you see all these elements borrowed from Bernini and from other Baroque masters from Italy, such as these hexagonal patterns on the window covering, or these Palladian arches in the vestibule, leading to lateral chapels. In the crypt lies the tomb of Christopher Wren, with a Latin inscription above that reads, Subtus conditur huius ecclesiae et urbis conditor, Christophorus Wren, qui vixit annos ultra nonaginta, non sibi, sed bono publico. Lector, si monumentum requiris, circumspice. Below is buried the founder of this church and city, Christopher Wren, who lived over 90 years, not for himself, but for the public good. Reader, if you seek a monument of him, look around. Christopher Wren lived to see the cathedral completed in 1710, something extremely rare in terms of great European churches, which often took several generations to be built. Wren was one of the few architects to oversee the entire construction process and see his work completed. That's why when you see St. Paul's Cathedral, it seems to harmonize in a special way. Unlike St. Peter in Rome, which was built by several architects, St. Paul's Dome seems to be much more a part of the building. Its grouping with the two fine symmetrical towers gives the parts and the whole a very cohesive harmony. You can really see how Wren is a great synthesizer of the past, absorbing English Gothic mass and lightness, French engineering and elegance, and Italian classicism and Baroque into something uniquely English. The finished building ranks amongst the finest Renaissance cathedrals in Europe. And its dome design defined a model that would be later adopted by the French in their Pantheon, which was then copied by the Russians in St. Isaac's Cathedral, and then by the Americans in their state capitals. Yet even with such a legacy, none of them quite match the serene balance and luminous grandeur of St. Paul's itself. I've made an extended version of this video where I go into more detail on the old St. Paul's Cathedral as well as the new one, and explore other places from where Christopher Wren took inspiration for his work. This longer video is available if you join as a channel member.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned and enjoyed. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you very soon in another episode. Goodbye.